Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler here at Extreme Performance Training Systems in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. In this episode I want to talk a little bit about some questions that I've received about how I train my fighters and combat athletes here at EPTS. I've got a few questions just kind of about their general training that I wanted to address because there's a lot of, there's a lot of talk online and in different magazines and blogs and stuff like that about how to train fighters, how to for strength training, cardio training, and things like that. And I think there's a lot of good information, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I just want to talk about some of the strategies that we've used here, how I got those strategies and those training methods, and what we've seen as far as their effectiveness in the training of our athletes. So right now, especially over the last year or so, I've been training combat athletes for a long time, everybody from wrestlers, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes, MMA fighters, even some boxers. And over the last year, I've really kind of ramped up working with a lot of these guys. Right now, we got about 7 or 8 guys coming in training for some sort of combat athletic sport, everything from wrestling to Jiu-Jitsu and MMA right now. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is as far as the strength training that we implement. And basically, none of them are really doing the same program. They're doing different tournaments. Some of them are in different sports. Some of them are doing jiu-jitsu, some of them are doing MMA, some are wrestling. So none of them train exactly the same, but a lot of the elements and a lot of the methods are utilized for each of the athletes. And because not all of them are at the same level of physical preparation, they're not all at the same level of strength, they don't have all the same aerobic conditioning, anaerobic conditioning levels. They don't have the same experience. Some are really experienced competitors, really experienced in the martial arts. Some of them are just starting out or at the intermediate level. So there's a whole range of physical abilities as well as skill and specific development. So none of them can really train the same. Some of them have a little bit of mileage, some of them are dealing with injuries, some of them are pretty injury free and can push pretty hard. So these are all factors that you have to take into consideration when working with multiple athletes. That's why I feel it's challenging if you're working with an entire team of athletes to implement the most optimal training program for each individual, because not everybody's at the same level of readiness. So because they are all at different levels of individual readiness and getting ready for different competitions and different periods of competition, each of them have their own program that I put together, and we adjust on a daily and weekly basis. But at the core of it, we use what's, I guess, often referred to as the conjugate system. A lot of what I learned has come from Louis Simmons and the work that he's done at his gym, Westside Barbell. He's probably one of my greatest mentors and somebody that I've been fortunate enough to actually visit Westside and work with and train there and learn from him and Tom and some of the athletes and the people up there. And it's just had a huge impact on, even though I've been following a lot of his methods since about 99, 2000 when I first learned of him, and kind of developing this over the near 20 years that I've been training people. In the last couple of years, because I've been able to go up there a handful of times and train and visit and learn from him, has really brought our training up another notch. And a lot of what we've implemented has just been based on that conjugate system that he's popularized. Now basically what we do is we don't really have training blocks. We look at training on a weekly basis, and each week, I guess you could look at that as a weekly microcycle of training. We have multiple training days. Now the fighters usually come in anywhere from 2, 3, or 4 days a week to train based on their schedule and their availability. So again, each one's an individual case, but we make sure that we train all velocities of strength on a weekly basis. So one day is going to be devoted to heavy lifting, the max effort method predominantly, and then one day is going to be devoted to dynamic effort work or speed strength, higher velocities, lower weights. So that's the basis of the program. Is we do implement the maximal effort method, the dynamic effort method, and we train all velocities of strength. Now that can even be further subdivided if you look at slow strength versus fast strength or fast weights. The slow strength is things like the max effort method, where you're working up to an all-time max, or basically above 90% of your best in a specific exercise. We also do a lot of what you consider strength speed. That's where we use a ton of band tension, usually somewhere around 50% of the individual's max on the bar in addition to bar weight. So again, the velocity is very, very slow because of the high amount of band tension and load on the bar. And then so those are our slow strength methods. Then we get to the faster movements and the faster methods, and these are things like the dynamic effort method, which we break down into speed strength, we break down into explosive strength, and then just absolute power development. So again, we're training all velocities from power all the way up to maximal effort strength. And we're doing that on a weekly basis. We take the idea that we want our guys to be at 90% or better all the time, so that when it comes time for a competition or a tournament, or if they've got an event that's more important, because most of these guys compete year-round, with the exception of the wrestler who has a season, but the MMA fighters and the jiu-jitsu players, they're competing all year long. So what we have to do is we've got to look at what the important events are, and then we've got to gear the training up to the important events, like the Pans, the Worlds. If there's a super fight or something like that, we're going to focus on those and make those the primary events, whereas some of the smaller tournaments, the Atlanta Open, some of the Newbury tournaments, some things like that are a little bit more local or a little bit more regional, we might not apply the same taper or the same level of preparation for. So we're going to try to stay at 90% or better year-round. Barring an injury, we should be able to do that. And then when it comes time for a major event or a major competition, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to taper, which I'll talk about later how we taper, so that they can realize all the strength and power and everything that they've developed in that training prior to the event, and they can transmute those physical qualities into a higher level of performance. So that's kind of how we build the training program. Now, one of the things that you have to consider when you're working with combat athletes is their weight. They're maintaining, it's a weight class sport, so do they need to, where do they usually walk around? Do they need to cut a little bit of weight to make their weight class? Do they need to cut a lot of weight? So these are things that you have to factor in, and that this plays into the training program mainly on the accessory work. Now, oftentimes we're using accessory work, which are typically more single joint exercises. We're doing that to either build muscle mass, to strengthen weak points, or we use it in more kind of a prehab or a rehab if they're recovering from an injury kind of capacity. And if you've got an athlete who has to make a big weight cut and they're already maxed out their weight class and they're not interested in moving up, you want to be very careful when you're implementing things that cause a great deal of muscular hypertrophy, because you don't want to make their weight cut any harder than it is. So if you've got an athlete who's actually trying to fill out a weight class, like a couple of our guys are right now, then you can focus a little bit more on hypertrophy work and help them put on some good quality muscle mass and help them fill out the next weight class that they're trying to move up to. So that's a big consideration, and will often dictate how we implement a lot of our accessory exercises. So we've got our max effort day, we've got our dynamic effort day, for lack of a better term, and then both days we always do accessory exercises where we're focused on building weak points. We might need to build some muscle mass, or we might need to implement some prehab or rehab exercises to help if they got some beat up joints, if they're recovering from an injury. But that's the basic structure of the workout. Now, those workouts do encompass things like cardiovascular training, conditioning, aerobic, anaerobic development, energy systems work, as well as strength, power, and such. So all that stuff is worked on a weekly basis. We just break it down for the athlete for their individual level of development and what it is they're trying to accomplish. One thing that I've noticed with a lot of the combat athletes that I work with, very few of them are at what you would consider a very high level of strength. So pretty much they can all benefit from getting stronger. Now, I look at strength as kind of a governor on all your other abilities. If you raise your level of strength, you're going to raise your body's ability to produce power. You're going to take your physical capacity to a higher level. So strength development is very important. And with a lot of these guys, you just need to focus on the basics. I always try to incorporate some sort of squatting, some sort of pulling, and some sort of pressing and pulling. And those are the movements that we try to develop strength in. So we use a variety of box squats with special bars. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the fighters and the combat athletes holding a straight bar on the back, because I do believe that external rotation of the shoulder plus a lot of loading on the shoulder joint is not the most optimal way for these guys to train the squat. So we'll use safety bars, we'll use cambered bars, safety squat bars, camber squat bars. We'll use belt squatting, which is fantastic because the load is placed on the hips. There's nothing on the shoulders. So we want to look at, these athletes are they're going to incur a lot of wear and tear over their competitive career. So we don't want to do things unnecessary in the gym when we've got better alternatives, or alternatives that will allow us to kind of circumvent a style of training. So there's no need for them to hold a straight bar and put a lot of stress on their shoulders if they could use a safety bar, if they could do a belt squat, if they could do a Zercher squat or something like that. So I want to look at where I can minimize wear and tear, because a lot of these guys are coming in beat up, their shoulders are tweaked up. So we want to try to keep those shoulders as healthy as possible and minimize the amount of stress that we place on them. Do a lot of pulling, a lot of variations in the deadlift. Predominantly, we're going to work sumo deadlifts even out of the rack, because I find that minimizes the stress on the lower back and builds up the hips to a huge degree, and that's something that these guys need. They need a lot of hip drive, a lot of hip strength, and to quote Louis Simmons, we've got a lot of exercises that we can do to strengthen the lower back, like reverse hypers, back extensions, good mornings, kettlebell work. There's a lot of exercises we can do that can strengthen up the lower back. So if we're going to max out on a deadlift, or we're going to go really heavy, I'd rather that they do a sumo deadlift. It's a little bit more protective for the lower back. Plus, we're going to get a lot of hip work, which is very important to these guys, and they seem to all be benefiting from it tremendously. So we do a lot of squats, we do a lot of deadlifts. As far as presses go, a lot of the pressing that we do is floor presses. I like this movement because the floor press takes the leg drive out of the movement, puts them on their back on the ground like they are in a fight, if they're ever on their back, and build some pushing strength from that position. Do a little bit of bench pressing, some dynamic effort bench pressing. We use the specialty bars quite a bit. We do a lot of work with the Swiss bar, which allows you to hold on parallel grip handles at various widths. It's a fantastic bar to have. We do a lot of work with the band bell bar because we find it to be very good for the shoulders, very therapeutic for the shoulders, and because of the way the bar vibrates and works in kind of a chaotic pattern, it really forces all the smaller muscles around the shoulder joint to kick in. So we look at it a little bit more for shoulder strength and health than we do, building a strong press. But when coupled with strength exercises for the press, it can enhance them to a great degree while keeping the shoulders strong and healthy. We do some various types of overhead work. Particularly, I love kettlebell work, overhead single arm presses or seesaw presses. A lot of it we'll have them sitting on the ground with their legs out in front of them. Alternating presses overhead. It's not only great for the shoulders, but it also brings the torso into play a lot. I try to find exercises that are gonna, we look at training economy. So if I can get more bang from my buck by having them do a shoulder press where they're sitting on the ground, pressing weights in an alternate fashion overhead, and we're gonna get a lot more work on the torso, then that's a little bit less specific work that we got to incorporate for some ab work and stuff at the end. So I want to make sure that I can get the biggest bang for my buck on a lot of these exercises, because I've only got these guys in the gym 2-3 times a week maybe. So if that's only like 2-3 hours, I really have to maximize the time that they put into their training. We do a lot of pulls, variety of pull-ups, variety of bent over rows, chest supported rows, dumbbell rows, and things like that. And again, if we look at training economy, one of the things that I try to do is challenge the grip. So a lot of the pulls that we do, instead of doing a regular pull-up, we might take a gi, throw it over a pull-up bar, and have them pinch grip the gi and do their pull-ups like that. And that's going to build a huge amount of grip strength and forearm strength, which is going to be very specific to their sport. We'll even do that. We'll wrap a gi under a barbell and do it for bent rows. We'll use fat grip attachments on the dumbbells and the bars to challenge the grip. So again, we're building up back strength, but we're also working the grip to a huge degree, and the grip is very important for a lot of these athletes. So we always try to find some squat, pull, press, and row pattern that we're building strength in. Again, focusing on the basics. Presses, rows, deadlifts, overhead presses, chins, and squat pattern lifts. So we take those six basic movement patterns, overload them, and get them stronger on those. And then we also use a lot of those movements on the dynamic effort day where we're trying to build explosive strength as well. So going to the basics is really important for a lot of these guys because they just lack the foundational strength that they need to perform at the highest level. So going back to the basics is very important. One of the questions that I get asked, real quick too, before we move on, I forgot. I want to mention that we are not afraid to max these guys. You hear a lot of debate about our 1 rep max is a good idea. Is it better to do a 3 rep max or a 5 rep max? And I don't care who the athlete is. if we're going to work up and we're going to take a weight, I'm going to use a single rep. The reason is that's going to allow for the greatest possible loading on the body. We're building the greatest inter and intramuscular coordination. We're taking advantage of the maximal effort method, which weights need to be in excess of 90% or greater. So I'd rather have them work up to a 1 rep max, because if you do a 3 rep max, you might not have exceeded the athlete's 90% capacity. You might be close to it, but if you do a 3 rep max or a 5 rep max, the loading is much less, probably more in the ballpark of 85% up to about 90%. And if it's a true 3 or 5 rep max, you're giving yourself 3 reps or 5 reps for something to go wrong, for form to break down. With a single rep max, you minimize a lot of those issues, and your body has protective mechanisms that it will implement to prevent you from getting hurt. So if you're physically fit, meaning you've built you've got a good foundation, you've got a good base, you've built muscle, your tendons, your ligaments, you've done the joint work. If you've got a good physical foundation, there's no reason that you can't take a 1 rep max. It's ridiculous the way people, you talk to some of these coaches and they act like you're going to get cancer if you do a 1 rep max, and it's stupid. I've never seen anybody get hurt in the gym doing a 1 rep max. I mean, I go to powerlifting meets all the time and I see, how many people, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 lifters at an event, and none of them are getting hurt, and they're maxing out in 3 different lifts usually. So it's all about preparation, making sure that the athlete's well prepared. But I'm a big fan of maxing these guys out, whether they're wrestlers, jiu-jitsu players, MMA fighters. But again, you've got to implement this stuff at the right time. I'm not going to max them out the day before a huge competition. So you've got to know how to take these training methods, these training variables, and apply them to each individual athlete and the athlete's sport. And that's why I'm a huge fan of the conjugate system. It allows for you to do that. It's not a training plan or a training template per se. Like, I hate training programs, but with the conjugate system, it's something that I can implement on a daily basis, on a weekly basis with these athletes, and customize it to each of their levels. So if you understand the methods of training, the maximal effort method, the dynamic effort method, and the repeated effort method, once you understand those basic training methods, it's up to you to put them into your athlete's sport. And I think that's one of the most important factors as a coach or a trainer. So I get asked about strength, which we covered, but I also get asked a lot about cardio, because you always hear, you watch UFC, oh, the guy's got good cardio, or his cardio's not good. You often hear, and cardio is such a generic term. And when I think of cardio, we talk about energy systems. Just for simplicity's sake, you've got the aerobic energy system, and then you've got the anaerobic energy system, which can be further subdivided into the lactic anaerobic or the alactic anaerobic. Basically, when you hear people talk about a fighter's cardio, I look at that as their efficiency. Okay, if you're going into a 5-round fight where you've got five 5-minute rounds separated by a minute rest, it's how conditioned your energy systems are to display all the necessary physical qualities or physical abilities that you need to display in that fight. And with an MMA fighter, with a jiu-jitsu player, with a wrestler, there's a lot of different things going on in there. You've got your strength, you've got your power, you've got your speed, you've got your endurance, your power endurance. There's so many, plus your skills that you're trying to implement. An MMA fighter's got a lot of skills. They got their stand-up game, they got their ground game, you get the clinch. Jiu-jitsu athletes have their own set of skills, wrestlers have their own set of skills, and it's all got to fit within the framework of the sport. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. But basically, when I think about, when I hear these commentators say his cardio is good or his cardio is bad, here's me say his movement efficiency is good, his movement efficiency is bad, or his physical efficiency is good or bad. So it's not just cardio for the sake of cardio, because if it was just cardio, any marathon runner would be a great fighter, right? And that's not the case. So aerobic development is one thing that needs to be focused on. Anaerobic development is something that needs to be focused on. And you also need to have the ability to produce power in those later rounds. So when I get asked about cardio, what I find is a lot of these guys, just the simple training of their sport is going to create some sort of adaptation, some sort of development of their energy systems. When you spar as an MMA fighter, you might not be going 100%, but you might be going close. You might not have the same adrenaline dump that you do in a fight, but you're going to be in a similar state. You're going to be working in a similar capacity as you do when you're fighting. So you're going to be getting some specific development just by the nature of training your sport. But when you look at the physical training, which all physical conditioning for any athlete is general physical preparation, or GPP. We look at general physical preparation, and we also look at the general specific. How can we transmute these general physical qualities into the individual sport? So when we talk about cardio, one of the things that I find these guys lacking is just their base development, just their base cardiovascular efficiency. And one of the best ways to train for that, and I think everybody needs to start out their training with, is cardiac output training. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into the specifics of why this is important. I highly suggest, if you're a trainer or an athlete, picking up Joel Jamieson's book. Actually, I think I write down here, it's Ultimate MMA Conditioning by Joel Jamieson. Not just for fight training, you can learn a lot about energy systems development. I mean, you could call this energy systems for dummies, because Joel does such a fantastic job in this book talking about the different energy systems and training modalities to implement for them. The book's worth its weight in gold, and one of the best books that I've ever purchased. But going back to the cardiac output training, basically what cardiac output training does is it's how much blood your heart can pump per beat. All right. So by doing cardiac output training, you're maximizing your cardiovascular efficiency. All right. So I look at this as base training. There's no reason to start doing high intensity interval training or higher levels of output training if you don't have this base cardiac output training taken care of, because it's going to be limiting your abilities at higher levels of output. So you want to make sure you make your cardiovascular system as efficient as possible by implementing this cardiac output training in an early stage of your training. It's really easy to do. A lot of guys find it really boring, but everybody's experienced nothing but 100% exceptional results with this training. Basically, 2 to 3 days a week, you train for about as little as 30 up to 90 minutes at a time. We want continuous movement. It doesn't mean just getting on the treadmill and going. You could circuit train, you could pull sleds, you could shadow box, you could get on a bike, an elliptical, just anything you can do while simultaneously tracking your heart rate. So you want to wear a heart rate monitor, but you want to keep your heart rate in the ranges of about 130 at the low end, 130 beats a minute, and up to about 150 beats a minute at the high end. So staying in that range continuously for a minimum of 30 or a maximum of 90 minutes 2 to 3 times a week. What most of my athletes have found is that by doing this sort of training for 4 to 6 weeks on up to about 8 weeks, they're usually able to make huge improvements in their cardiovascular efficiency. A lot of them find a lot more energy on the mats, they don't get tired as quickly, they recover faster, and that's exactly what this type of training does. And I feel that when we're talking about particularly combat athletes' cardio, that's usually where they're lacking. They do tons of circuit training already, they do tons of interval training, but they don't have that base cardiovascular efficiency.